You know, when you think about the rules that protect people in scientific research, you'd probably think they're just common sense, right? But the truth is, they weren't dreamed up in some quiet, sterile lab. No, their history is, well, it's a lot darker than that. These rules were forged in tragedy. And that's the story, as complex and sometimes painful as it is, that we're going to dive into today.
All right, so to get started, I want to tell you about this one experiment. It's really fascinating, but also kind of unsettling. And you'll see how it just cracks open the door to this huge ethical dilemma. So there was this researcher, Dr. Richter, and he wanted to test the limits of stress resistance. His idea? Pretty radical. He put rats into these beakers of water they couldn't escape from, basically forcing them to swim for their lives. The whole point was just to time them, to see how long they could last. But then he tried a second version of the experiment. This time, right before a rat was about to give up from sheer exhaustion, he'd pull it out. He'd let it rest and then put it back in the water. And the result? Oh man, it was just absolutely staggering. So for Dr. Richter, the answer was crystal clear. That huge difference in swim time, it had nothing to do with physical strength. Nope. It all came down to one thing: hope. Just being saved that one time had given them a reason to keep fighting. Think about that. What a powerful, powerful idea.
I mean, it's an incredible insight into the power of hope, right? But it forces us to ask a question that changes the whole picture. What was the ethical cost of that knowledge and that tension, that push and pull between discovery and what's right? That's exactly what we're talking about today.
And this brings us right to a core idea, something absolutely fundamental: informed consent. You see, an animal can't give it, but a human can. A human can understand the risks and agree to participate. And yet, for decades, that basic principle was just ignored, tragically ignored. And the lack of it, well, that's what led to some of the absolute darkest chapters in the history of science.
Okay, so we're about to get into some really difficult territory here. It's not easy to talk about, but it's absolutely crucial if we want to understand why the rules we have today are so incredibly strict. Let's start with the Tuskegee Study. It's one of the most infamous and heartbreaking examples out there. For 40 years, researchers just watched syphilis destroy the bodies of hundreds of men. They had the cure. Penicillin was a known cure, but they deliberately withheld it, all just to see what would happen. And then you have the absolute horror of World War II. The concentration camps, places like Auschwitz, they were turned into laboratories. They became places for experiments of a cruelty that is almost impossible to comprehend. It was the complete twisting of medicine, turning it into a tool for pure barbarism.
You know, when you look at these horrific events, Tuskegee, the Nazi experiments, even studies where disabled kids were deliberately infected with diseases, you start to see a pattern, a terrible pattern. They always targeted vulnerable people. Consent was never even a thought, and the pursuit of knowledge was placed so far above human dignity that it led to just immense suffering.
After horrors like these, the world just couldn't look away anymore. Something had to be done. And the ethical codes that came out of this, they're not just boring regulations or red tape. You should think of them more like shields forged in fire to protect us, sometimes from our own unchecked desire for knowledge.
And what's so telling when you look at this timeline is that scientific ethics has almost always been reactive. It hasn't been proactive. Every single one of these major codes was a direct response to a tragedy. You have the Nuremberg Code in 1947, born directly from the ashes of the concentration camps. Then in '64, the Declaration of Helsinki built on that, creating a global standard. And finally, in '79, the Belmont Report was commissioned in the US after the truth about the Tuskegee Study finally came out. It's a history of lessons written in pain.
But out of all these documents, the Belmont Report from 1979 it's a real cornerstone. Because it did something incredible. It took all of this complex, painful history and distilled it down into 3 simple, powerful, universal principles.
And these 3 pillars, they're not just words. They're the very foundation of all modern ethical research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice.
And this is what's so brilliant about it. You can draw a straight line from each principle back to a specific horror it was designed to prevent. Respect for persons, that's the direct antidote to the dehumanization of Auschwitz. It says every person has a choice. Beneficence, that's the wall built against experiments designed to harm. It means you must do good, and above all, do no harm. And justice, that's the answer to the exploitation of Tuskegee. It says you can't place the burden of research on one vulnerable group while everyone else gets the benefits. So, after all this, what's the takeaway? What's the legacy of this difficult history? And maybe more importantly, why does any of this matter to us
right here, right now. Well, here's the bottom line. Every single time you or someone you know participates in a clinical trial or any kind of research study, your safety, your dignity, it all rests on these principles. They're not just abstract rules buried in a document. They are promises. Promises literally written with the tears of the past, all to protect our future.
So when you hear those names, the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, don't just think of them as documents. They are the bedrock. They are the very foundation of any trust we can possibly have in science today. And that is their legacy.
And that kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it? We started with that story about the rat and the power of hope, but it was also a warning, wasn't it? A stark reminder of just how dangerous a science without a conscience can be. The entire journey we've just talked about, it's been the long, hard road to building that conscience.
Which, of course, leaves us with the big question for today. We're facing whole new frontiers now, right? Things like genetic editing, artificial intelligence, they're throwing up brand new ethical problems we've never faced before. So will the lessons of the past, lessons that were learned in such a painful way, be enough to guide us into the future? Honestly, the question is wide open. And this conversation, it's far from over. In fact, it's really just beginning.